I have long been critical of the federal government of Canada's use of the Emergencies Act to respond to the Freedom Convoy. And the reason why is because it was clear government overreach at a time when it was not necessary. The swiftness in the way in which the government was able to invoke it was very scary from a civil society perspective. The government almost overnight invoked the Emergencies Act when it was no longer necessary, and all it required was a majority vote in the House of Commons. Now, I know the Liberal Party of Canada is in a minority position, meaning it needed the NDP to support it, but imagine for a second there was a majority government, regardless of party. At any moment, that party can invoke the Emergencies Act. They can invoke the Emergencies Act. Think about that. That is scary for civil society. And this is why. So in 2022, the Freedom Convoy protests are happening in Ottawa. And it was more than just truckers going to Ottawa and honking their horns. Sympathizers then went to border crossings in Coutts, Alberta, and in Windsor, Ontario. Now, for those that don't know, millions of dollars of trade flow in between Canada and the United States, and probably between those two border crossings, a lot of money passes through on a daily basis. So protesters shutting down those key critical infrastructure points could be considered national security threat, a major reputational damage to Canada, major pressure from the federal government of the United States to get things opened up ASAP. So from those perspectives, I can understand why any prime minister would consider this a national security threat. Canada and the United States have a very unique relationship, and we trade a lot of goods and services between the two countries. So impacting those trade routes, major deal. Those trade routes need to stay open. Reality, though, is that provincial governments in both Alberta and Ontario were able to dismantle those border blockades quite efficiently and effectively. And I believe the government of Alberta even told the federal government they don't need their help. They've got this. And they dismantled the border blockades in Coutts, Alberta, and Ontario at Windsor. A day and a half or almost 2 days later, the federal government invokes the Emergencies Act. Now, the Emergencies Act gives the government sweeping powers. They can get rid of public gatherings. They can freeze bank accounts. They can do all types of things. It basically turns the federal government in some ways into very much a central commander of how we as civil society organize and even criticize the government. It takes away a lot of our powers, which is why back in February 2022, I wrote the Prime Minister of Canada a lengthy letter, you can find it on my website, about how invoking the Emergencies Act violates our charter rights and freedoms at a time when it's not necessary. Those blockades at those critical infrastructure points came down. I even highlighted areas in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that the Emergencies Act violates. And to my knowledge, there is no national security threat. Well, fast forward to the Freedom Convoy inquiry, which was done. An independent inquiry was done, interviewing the Prime Minister, ministers at the time, the organizers of the Freedom Convoy. And that inquiry found the federal government met the high threshold to invoke the Emergencies Act, completely doing away with the notion that this was invoked after the blockades came down at those two key critical border crossings. How could any inquiry come to that conclusion? How could any inquiry, regardless of left or right or whatever, wherever you are on the political spectrum, how could it ignore that key fact? That's what I don't understand about our governments and the institutions inside our country. This is very concerning, again, from a civil society perspective. It just seems to me that the inquiry was there to validate the federal government's act. That's the case because the Emergencies Act, to me, was a clear violation of our charter rights and freedoms and was unnecessary at the time of its invocation. But you don't have to take my word for it. Fast forward to almost a year after the inquiry was released, a federal court judge rules the invocation of the Emergencies Act is unjustifiable. Now, I'm going to read some excerpts of the court ruling, and I'll leave the full PDF below if you want to take a look for yourself. The federal courts look at what is a national security threat, and they use the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS's, definition of national security threat. The courts conclude there was insufficient evidence that the situation exceeded provincial capacity or authority, meaning the federal government didn't need to step in. You see, Alberta and Ontario, they had it under control. In fact, Alberta emphasized that the government of Canada should have considered whether the proportion of the situation exceeded their provincial capacity. Alberta even says that alternative measures within existing laws were available and should have been considered before invoking the Emergencies Act. The government says they invoked it because of the economic impacts, the threat of violence, and the inability to enforce the rule of law in specific areas. But the courts say that was unnecessary because, again, the blockades came down before the invocation of the Emergencies Act. So clearly the provinces had the capacity to handle these protests. As well, the CSIS director briefs cabinet and says there is no national security threat to Canada. There is no national security threat to Canada, is what the CSIS director tells cabinet. And still the government invokes the Emergencies Act. How is this possible? In Canada, how is this possible? And again, this is not about left and right and hating on Liberals and hating on Conservatives or NDP. This is about our government being, in this case, quite tyrannical and operating on the majority of the House voting in favor. Now, let me pose this to you as well. I can see the Liberal Party voting along party lines, right? The Prime Minister and the Cabinet say there's a national emergency, and without enough evidence, I could see MP saying, yeah, okay, well, they clearly must know that they're being briefed on national security issues. They must know. So I can give, to an extent, some Liberal MPs a bit of a pass because they trust the Cabinet and the Prime Minister are being briefed. What I don't understand is how the NDP could support the Liberals without any evidence that there's a national security threat. And the implication that that had for Canadians, that one party could support another, have a majority vote in the House, and suddenly the Emergencies Act is enacted, is a major flaw in the way we govern here in Canada. In my opinion, the Emergencies Act should only be invoked if a majority of the provinces, one of those provinces being either Ontario or Quebec, votes in favor of invoking the Emergencies Act. The invocation of the Emergencies Act happens with a majority vote in the House of Commons, which is so flawed because it's clear that the Cabinet and the Prime Minister were not briefed, they were briefed, and the information clearly showed that it was not a national emergency, and they still went ahead with it. How is that possible? This should not be left to any political party in the federal government, nor should it be left to a majority in the House of Commons. That should not be the case, because a majority government can come along and invoke the Emergencies Act, maybe even without a vote in the House. Just whip everybody in the party to vote in favor of it, and the Emergencies Act is in place. This is very scary from a civil society perspective. I think this is a clear example of how we as Canadians can easily allow our governments to go down this path. Now, the Emergencies Act was revoked, I believe, 24 to 48 hours after it was invoked. So it only lasted a couple of days, but it just goes to show how swiftly our governments can act. We can't build a subway in Toronto to save our lives, but we can be very swift in the federal government to invoke the Emergencies Act, which gives the government sweeping powers over public gatherings and our charter rights and freedoms. This is very concerning. The only way the invocation of the Emergencies Act should ever be used in the future should be on the basis of a majority of provinces agreeing alongside the federal government. That's the only way this could happen. Because at that point, if the majority of provinces agree, there clearly is a national security threat. As well, I would actually also give weight to the CSIS director who confirms there is a national security threat. So, majority of provinces, CSIS director, everyone singing from the same or similar songbook of perhaps even different political leanings, all saying, yeah, there's a massive national security threat. We need to invoke the Emergencies Act. That would be my recommendation to the federal government. I'm going to write the federal government. I will write all of this down and throw it out there. But I wanted to make this video because the institutions in our country are at the whim of our political masters. And this is very scary. We should all, as Canadians of every single walk, every single political affiliation, be very concerned that our government has that ability to invoke the Emergencies Act with just a majority in the House of Commons, which can easily happen. It's not nearly as difficult as one might think. And the implications that has for every Canadian citizen is wild.